The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song as Sarah Chen pushed through the employee entrance at 11:24 p.m., her hands trembling slightly as she clocked in. 3 years. 3 years of night shifts at Sacred Heart in Raleigh, and her hand still shook before the work began. Not from fear. From remembering. The ER corridor smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, the copper iron scent of blood someone hadn't quite cleaned from the trauma bay floor. Sarah moved through it like a woman walking through her own house in the dark. Every cart position. Every supply location. The exact moment the automatic doors would hiss open before someone reached them. Muscle memory made flesh. She stopped at her locker and pulled out the photo. Michael in his army dress uniform, dress blue so crisp they could cut glass, his regulation smile frozen forever at age 24. Sangin, 2012. The photo had traveled with her through 7 different hospitals in 4 different states, always tucked into the same spot in her scrub pocket, always touching it between patients like a prayer to a god she'd stopped believing in when they brought her his things in a plastic bag. The break room was empty. 11:53 p.m. The other night shift nurses wouldn't arrive for another 7 minutes. Sarah watered the succulent on the windowsill, still dying, still refusing to cooperate, still reminding her of something, and poured lukewarm coffee from a pot that had been sitting since the day shift left. The mug in her hand said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A gift from Michael 2 years before Sangin. Before everything broke. She held the coffee but didn't drink it. The steam rose like ghosts. Her reflection in the break room window looked like a woman who'd been underwater for 3 years and had only recently learned to breathe again. Night shift, Chen. Sarah didn't turn. She knew the voice before he spoke. Dr. Marcus Hargrove. The ER director moved through the hospital the way men moved through rooms when they'd never been told no, shoulders first, chin raised, wearing his white coat like it was a crown. He was 48, expensively dressed under the coat, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses, not sun exposure. His watch cost more than Sarah made in 3 months. She knew this because she'd looked. She'd looked at a lot of things about Dr. Hargrove over the past 8 months. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. Her voice came out soft. Deferential. The voice of a woman who'd learned to take up less space. "Good." He poured his own coffee, deliberately not using the same pot, instead using the French press someone had brought in from home. "We're expecting a busy night. Supposed to be an accident on Route 40. Construction site collapse. Multiple injuries incoming." Understood. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary. She felt the weight of his attention like pressure behind her eyes. Hargrove was the kind of man who looked at people and saw either obstacles or assets. Nothing in between. Sarah had watched him this way before, calculating, assessing. His presence made the air pressure change, the way a storm front arrives before the rain. "Make sure you're ready," he said finally. "I'll need the trauma bays prepped. And Chen, no overtime tonight. We're watching costs." Sarah nodded. She understood what he meant. She always understood. The quiet message underneath the words, "You cost too much. You ask too many questions. You're getting good at things you shouldn't be good at." The ER came alive at 12:17 a.m. Not gradually. Not with warning. Just suddenly the floor was moving, voices sharp and urgent, the smell of night shift desperation replacing the quiet of midnight. Sarah moved through it all with the steady precision of someone who'd done this before in places that didn't allow mistakes. She prepped Trauma Bay 3, checking the defibrillator, the 4 stands, the oxygen lines. Everything exactly where it needed to be. Everything ready for breaking people open. A paramedic shouted from the main entrance, "Incoming." ETA for minutes. Construction accident, multiple trauma, one with spinal precautions. The doors burst open with the weight of 4 paramedics and a stretcher. Sarah moved into position without thinking. The body on the stretcher was a man in his 50s, construction worker covered in dust and blood. His left leg was bent wrong. Compound fracture. His left side was crushed. Pneumothorax likely. His eyes were panicked until they locked onto something in the room, and the panic stopped. He was looking at Sarah. She'd been in the trauma bay, moving toward his head to check his airway. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and something in her chest cracked open. Recognition. Not of his face. Of something deeper. Something that lived in muscle memory and scar tissue. Master Sergeant Torres, one of the paramedics, was calling out, "Stay still, don't move your head, we've got spinal precautions in place." Sarah's hands froze. Master Sergeant David Torres. Michael's commanding officer. The man who'd kept her son alive through 2 deployments across the mountains of Afghanistan. The man who should have brought Michael home. The man who'd been standing beside Michael when the IED detonated in Sangin. She made her hands move. Professionalism took over like armor sliding into place. She checked his pupils, reactive, equal. She felt for his carotid pulse, strong, steady, the pulse of a man still fighting. His right arm was badly lacerated but intact. His left side was the problem. The crushing trauma had collapsed that section of his chest, and she could already hear the diminished breath sounds. "Chest decompression kit," she said quietly to the nurse beside her. "Get me a 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." The nurse moved. Torres was breathing, but barely, the effort visible in the way his good shoulder rose and fell. His eyes found Sarah's again over the oxygen mask. He didn't speak. He couldn't speak and breathe at the same time. But his eyes asked the question every patient asked in the moment when their body was failing them, "Are you going to let me die?" "I've got you," Sarah said, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with hospital protocol. Her hands moved over his chest, assessing, planning, the trembling gone completely. Her hands were steady now. Her hands knew what to do. They'd done this before in sandstorms and on the sides of mountains and in the dark of night when there was no protocol, just staying alive and getting people home. "Pressure's dropping," another nurse called out. "BP 85/55 and falling." Sarah was already preparing the needle. The kit came into her hands and she didn't hesitate. Insert. Angle. The rush of air as the tension pneumothorax released. Torres gasped. His oxygen saturation climbed, 72. 78, 84. Almost there. Almost enough. She stepped back. Let the nurses continue. Let the machines take over. Let everything look normal and by protocol for the cameras and the witnesses. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the trauma bay doorway at exactly 12:31 a.m. He watched the scene, watched Sarah stepping away from Torres, watched the careful arrangement of tubes and lines and machines that made it look like everything had gone exactly according to procedure. Nothing irregular. Nothing that would require explanation. But his eyes narrowed. "Status?" he asked. "Compound fracture left leg, crush injury to left thorax, probable pneumothorax and hemothorax," Sarah reported, her voice calm and measured. Breath sounds diminished on left. Pressure dropping rapidly. He needed immediate decompression. And who ordered that procedure? He was coding, Sarah said. Hypoxia critical. No time to wait for a resident. Hargrove stepped closer to the stretcher. Torres's eyes were conscious, aware, fixed on the ceiling. He was deaf, the paramedics had noted it on their run sheet, and he couldn't hear the conversation happening around him. But he could see Hargrove looking at him the way a man looks at an inconvenience. "Get him stabilized," Hargrove said. "Then move him to ICU." He turned to Sarah. "Assist the resident when he arrives. Don't make any more independent decisions." "Yes, doctor." He lingered for a moment, something calculating moving across his face like a shadow. Sarah had seen that look before. It was the look of a man who'd just noticed something he didn't like. Something that threatened the careful arrangement of his world. Then he left. Sarah stood at Torres's bedside and adjusted his fall line, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd memorized the geography of keeping people alive. She couldn't look at him. Couldn't let herself see Michael's commanding officer and think about Michael lying in a field 8,000 miles away with a hole in his chest. Torres's hand moved slightly. Just a tremor. His eyes shifted toward her. He couldn't speak, not yet, not with the tubes and the damage and the shock working through his system, but his eyes asked again, "Do you know me?" Sarah checked his SATS one more time. They were holding. 89, stable. Almost safe. "Rest now," she said quietly. "You're going to make it." But that wasn't true for everyone who came through these doors. She knew that better than anyone. Some people made it. Some people broke. Some people's names just disappeared from records like they'd never existed at all, like they'd been erased before they were even buried. The morning rounds began at 6:47, 17 minutes before the official schedule. Dr. Hargrove liked to arrive early, liked to be the first voice Torres heard, liked to make Sarah's station the first stop. He swept into the trauma bay with 2 residents trailing behind him, clipboards and nervousness in their wake, and Sarah was there. She was always there, adjusting the IV drip, watching the monitor climb from 88 to 91% oxygen saturation. Hargrove's eyes found her immediately. He moved with the fluid precision of a man who'd never doubted his place in a room, his white coat pressed into sharp creases, his shoes polished to a shine that reflected fluorescent light. Sarah had already documented Torres's vitals onto the chart 30 minutes earlier: blood pressure 142/88, heart rate stable at 76, the kind of numbers that meant the patient was holding. Holding. That word mattered when your son's commanding officer was the one in the hospital bed. "Nurse Chen," Hargrove said, and his voice carried the particular edge of a man about to make a point. Not a question. Not a greeting. A summons delivered as theatrical announcement, loud enough that Torres's daughter, Michael's sister in all but name, though Sarah didn't know that yet, looked up from her father's bedside, eyes already tight with the vigilance of someone protecting a loved one who couldn't protect himself. Hargrove took the clipboard from Sarah's hands without asking. His fingers were cold. She felt the temperature change before she felt the violation of it, this man moving through her documentation the way an inspector moves through a building looking for code violations, looking for proof of incompetence. He pulled a red pen from his coat pocket, an actual red pen, because subtlety was for people who worried about consequences, and began crossing out her numbers with aggressive diagonal strokes. "These vital signs," he said, each word clipped and performed for the residents, "are documented incorrectly. Blood pressure 142/88? That's not consistent with a trauma patient post-operative recovery. Did they not teach basic charting at whatever school you attended?" He looked up from the chart, made eye contact with Torres's daughter, made sure she understood that her father's care had been compromised by this woman's incompetence. The red pen moved across Sarah's documentation like a weapon. Sarah took one measured breath. Held it. Released it with the control of someone who had learned, long ago in a sandstorm outside Sangin, that composure was the only currency that mattered when everything else was being stripped away. One tear escaped down her left cheek before she wiped it calmly with the back of her hand, a small gesture that no one but Hargrove registered, and even he was watching with the satisfaction of a man who'd just confirmed his own dominance. "The documentation is accurate, Doctor," Sarah said, and her voice had changed, dropped lower, steadier, carrying underneath it the weight of someone speaking from a place he couldn't see. "I've recorded worse injuries than this." She didn't take the clipboard back. She didn't defend herself further. She simply stood there, present, unmoved by the red pen or the public humiliation or the way Torres's daughter was now looking at her with a confusion that bordered on apology. Hargrove smiled. That was the worst part. The smile, which meant he'd gotten what he wanted, which meant the real work was just beginning. By 8 o'clock that morning, a complaint appeared on the public unit board in the break room, printed on official Sacred Heart letterhead, typeface cold and formal. The charge read, "Insubordination, questioning physician orders CT scan authorization, patient Torres." Date and time stamped. Sarah's name listed in bold. Hargrove's signature at the bottom, a flourish of complete confidence. The CT scanning question had been ordered at 3 in the morning, while Torres was stable, while his trauma assessment showed no indication for imaging beyond the initial X-rays already completed. Sarah had simply asked, whether the scan was medically necessary. That question, documented in the chart, had become insubordination. That question had become a public stain. Nurses who'd worked night shifts with her for 3 years began to avoid the break room when she entered. Sarah watched the pattern, the clock ticking to 6:48 in the morning, sunlight beginning to cut through the hospital windows, and then the exodus. Melissa from the ICU, who'd asked Sarah for dosage calculations just yesterday, suddenly needed to check on a patient. Chen, no relation, stood and left, her coffee half-finished. 3 orderlies who usually lingered over crossword puzzles began finding reasons to be anywhere else. The break room cleared like a room clearing before a storm, before the lightning came. By lunch, there was a nickname. Sarah heard it whispered in the supply corridor, floating through the hallway behind her like a ghost with a voice, Hargrove's pet problem. That's what they were calling her. Not Sarah. Not the competent one. Not even the night shift nurse. She'd become a problem that belonged to the department director, a woman who questioned, who pushed back, who didn't know her place. The isolation tasted like copper. Not blood, not her own blood, anyway. The copper taste of fear, or maybe just the taste of every time before when she'd been pushed out, every base transfer, every moment when the uniform came off and she wasn't senior chief anymore, wasn't the woman who'd planned operations in Kandahar or held her son's body in her hands in the dust of Sangin Valley. She was just a nurse. Just a woman with a questionable chart and a mouth that asked dangerous questions. That afternoon, Sarah found another charge in Torres's medical record, a $3,000 medical equipment rental that hadn't been used. The equipment was listed as deployed, the hours logged, the billing submitted to insurance, but Torres's chart showed no evidence of it ever being applied. Sarah pulled the physical record from the storage unit, found the blank spaces where the equipment should have left documentation, and felt something crystallize inside her, the knowledge that Hargrove wasn't just a bully. He was something worse. He was systematic. She approached the nurse's station at 4 o'clock, when the shift was beginning to overlap, when people were passing through, when there would be witnesses. She was going to ask about the equipment charge, going to raise the discrepancy formally, going to do exactly what a competent nurse with a conscience did when something didn't add up. Hargrove was waiting. Not literally, he wasn't standing there with his hands folded, anticipating her move. But he'd been waiting in the way predators wait, with the patience of someone who knows his prey will eventually approach the trap. He appeared at the nurse's station exactly as Sarah was pulling the file, his presence announced by the particular pressure change that came with him entering a space, that voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and heavy and ready to move. "You seem very interested in matters above your pay grade, Nightingale," he said, and the nickname landed like a physical blow, this deliberate inversion of the name Florence Nightingale, saint of nursing, into something demeaning. "Maybe you should focus on bedpans and leave medicine to the doctors." He smiled at her the way a man smiles at a door he's just locked, satisfied with the finality of it. Sarah met his eyes. That was the moment that would matter later, though neither of them knew it yet, the moment when she decided that survival meant something different than it had before. She'd survived Sangin. She'd survived the extraction, the debrief, the classified briefing that erased her from every record she'd ever filled out. She could survive one doctor with a red pen and a nickname and a scheme that was probably making him $60,000 a year. She wiped her hands on her scrubs, a gesture small enough that he almost missed it, a gesture that meant she was clearing something away. "I've been broken by better men than you, doctor," she said, and the words came out the way steel comes out, cold and immovable and absolutely final. Not loud. Not angry. Just stated as fact, the way you state that the sky is blue or that blood is red. The way you state something that everyone can see but no one is brave enough to acknowledge. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Sarah turned back to the file, to the equipment charge, to the documentation that proved everything, and Hargrove realized in that moment, that terrible, clarifying moment, that he had made a mistake. He had pushed a woman he knew nothing about, pushed her in front of a patient's family, pushed her in public, and she had not broken. She had not cried. She had not apologized or explained or defended herself with the desperation he'd expected. Instead, she'd become something worse. She'd become certain. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next, what Hargrove did with the knowledge that his usual methods weren't working, what a competent but cornered man does when simple humiliation fails to achieve the desired result. The worst part was that he didn't stop. He escalated. By the end of the shift, Sarah's personnel file had 3 new entries: the insubordination charge, a formal complaint about unsafe documentation practices, and a note questioning her basic clinical judgment. Hargrove had spent his afternoon on the phone with 2 board members from his medical school class, both of them sitting in comfortable offices in the hospital's administrative wing, both of them listening to his careful narrative about personnel management concerns and problematic staff behavior. He'd contacted risk management, had them flag Torres's case not for the actual trauma, which was healing well, but because the patient was deaf, because communication barriers create liability, because a man with institutional power could make language into a weapon, could turn difference into danger. Sarah sat at the edge of the parking lot at shift change, still wearing her scrubs, her name badge catching the late afternoon sun. In her pocket, against her ribs, was the photograph of Michael in his Army Ranger uniform, taken 2 days before Sangin, before everything became ash and classified files and the kind of silence that never really ended. She touched it without taking it out, just pressed her palm against it through the cotton, and thought about what comes after you've been broken by better men than this. What comes after is that you become someone who cannot afford to break again. The rain started at 5 o'clock, came without warning, without the mercy of a slow beginning. It hammered the pavement like applause from an angry crowd, and Sarah didn't move. She sat there with water running down her face and her dead son's commanding officer asleep in a hospital bed where he should have been recovered by now, where he should have been going home to his daughter, to a life that didn't involve a department director with a red pen and a scheme that was killing patients through neglect. The phone in her scrub pocket buzzed. Not the hospital phone. Not the one that connected her to the trauma bay or the ICU or anyone who mattered in this institutional landscape. It was her personal phone, the one she used for nothing, the one that rang almost never. An unknown number. A 703 area code. Virginia. She looked at it ringing in her hand, lit up against the rain, and something in her chest shifted. Something in the careful architecture of her survival, the layers of concealment, the separation between who she'd been and who she was pretending to be, began to develop a small, impossible crack. She didn't answer it. Not yet. Not while she was still a nurse. Not while she was still anyone. But she would. And when she did, everything would change. The monitors told the story Hargrove refused to read. Torres's heart rate climbed to 118, then 127, then 135, a steady acceleration toward collapse. His blood pressure drifted downward like a ship slipping beneath the surface. Sarah watched from the medication cart, her hands moving automatically through inventory she didn't need to count, her eyes fixed on the cardiac rhythm strip unfurling across the screen in Torres's trauma bay. The pattern was unmistakable. Fluid. Building around his heart. Compressing it. Crushing it with every beat. She had seen this once before. Sangin Valley, outside the FOB, under a sky the color of burnt copper. A 22-year-old Marine with shrapnel in his chest cavity, the pericardium filling with blood faster than his body could compensate. She'd been embedded with Task Force 3-1, the combat medic nobody knew existed, and she'd performed a needle decompression in a sandstorm while rounds snapped overhead like angry insects. The Marine had lived. Torres would die if someone didn't move now. 12 hours had passed since Hargrove reassigned her to triage. 12 hours of watching through doorways and monitor screens as the ER director methodically eliminated every option for treating David Torres. The first call came at 7 a.m., Dr. Martinez, the interventional cardiologist. Sarah heard Hargrove in the hallway, voice smooth as polished stone. Risk management flagged this patient. Liability concern. Non-compliant deaf male, construction accident, refusing standard protocols. Dr. Martinez had entered the room for exactly 4 minutes. He came back out shaking his head. I can't touch it. Too much exposure. By 9 a.m., Dr. Okonkwo arrived for consultation. Same song. Different verse. Hargrove says he refused treatment. Sarah heard the doubt in Okonkwo's voice, the space where the wrong answer could still fit. But Hargrove filled it before she could move. Documented refusal. Charts updated. Risk management already involved. Okonkwo's shoulders dropped. He signed something to his colleague and walked. 7 minutes total. Dr. Sullivan came next. Then Dr. Patel. Then Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Ramirez. 7 physicians. 7 consultations. 7 refusals. Hargrove had made calls. Sarah caught fragments of conversation near the physician's lounge. 2 board members owe me from the imaging contract. Risk management will back me up. Tell them it's a liability nightmare. Each doctor left looking uncomfortable, but none of them fought. None of them pushed back. Fear was contagious, and Hargrove had weaponized it with surgical precision. Torres's daughter, Maya, a military intelligence officer whose jaw looked carved from the same stone as her father's, had pleaded with each one. Her hands moving frantically in ASL, signing information her father couldn't hear because nobody would speak to him directly. Torres watched from his bed, his scarred hands gripping the rail, understanding perfectly that he'd been abandoned. His body understood it too. Blood pressure 94/58 at noon. By 3 p.m., it had dropped to 88/52. Sarah had approached Hargrove directly at 6 p.m., when the evening shift was still light and there were fewer witnesses. She'd kept her voice level, professional, a nurse asking a physician for clinical guidance, the only role he permitted her to play. David Torres is showing signs of pericardial effusion. Heart rate's climbing. BP's falling. His O2 sat is compensating now, but then perhaps you should have documented his condition more accurately, Nightingale. Hargrove's use of her assigned nickname was deliberate. A reminder of her place. His eyes were cold as stainless steel, the eyes of a man who had already decided. This looks like medical neglect on your part. Your documentation is inconsistent. I'm reassigning you to triage effective immediately. Torres is no longer your responsibility. The words hadn't hurt. Sarah had absorbed worse in sandstorms and safe houses and interrogation rooms where the goal was to break people into pieces they could never reassemble. But the implications crystallized with each passing hour. Reassignment meant no access to Torres's room. No ability to advocate. No hands at his bedside when the moment came. At 8 p.m., Hargrove altered the chart. Sarah saw it on the computer system when she pulled records for triage intake. Patient stable. Vital signs within acceptable parameters. Recommend continued observation. A lie written in clinical language, preserved in the official record. No emergency flags. No urgent alerts. Nothing to trigger intervention from night staff who would come on duty in 90 minutes. By 10:13 p.m., Torres was crashing in slow motion. Heart rate 142. Blood pressure 76/40. The monitors hissed their digital warnings into the darkness of the ER. Sarah stood at the triage desk 3 bays away, processing insurance information for a patient with a dislocated shoulder, her eyes tracking the rhythm strip that was no longer a rhythm, it was a scream rendered in electrical impulses. Pericardial tamponade. The heart compressed by fluid. Every beat less effective than the last. Death was arriving on a schedule, and everyone could see it except the man who owned the calendar. Maya Torres stood at her father's bedside, her hand signing frantically, "Help coming. Help coming. Help is coming," but her eyes had already registered the betrayal. She was military intelligence. She understood what happened when an institution decided you weren't worth saving. Her father's hands had started to shake. Not from pain. From the terrible clarity of a soldier recognizing his final abandonment. Sarah set down her pen. The shoulder dislocation intake form could wait. The insurance information could wait. Everything could wait except the decision forming in her hands like a fist. Michael's voice arrived without summoning. Torres never left anyone behind, Mom. Never. Not once. She thought of her son's funeral. Closed casket because there wasn't enough of him left to show. The military representative reading the same words they always read, valor, sacrifice, duty. Torres standing in the third row, his massive frame bowed, his presence at the service the closest he could come to an apology for surviving when Michael hadn't. The night nurse supervisor, Janet, was on her phone in the break room. Sarah had 15 minutes before the midnight shift change. Hargrove had gone home at 7 p.m. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, no relation, was in the physician's lounge. The security guard, Marcus, was outside the front entrance doing a patrol. Risk management would be closed. The board members would be asleep in their mansions in Raleigh's North End, their phones on silent, their consciences equally unreachable. Sarah moved toward the medication room instead of the triage desk. The cardiac tamponade kit lived on the third shelf, behind the chest tube supplies. A spinal needle. An 18-gauge angiocath. Saline. A 3-way stopcock. Everything needed for an emergency needle decompression, a procedure that took 90 seconds and saved lives when surgery wasn't available. A procedure that technically fell outside her scope as a nurse. A procedure that would require her to place a needle directly into the pericardial sac and withdraw the fluid crushing Torres's heart. She had done it once before in Sangin. In a firefight. With sand in her teeth and her commanding officer's voice in her ear, go. You're cleared. Do it now. She had never done it since. The procedure had lived in her hands for 8 years like a secret she couldn't speak. Now Hargrove had made sure speaking wouldn't help anyway. Sarah gathered the supplies. The movement was automatic, muscle memory indistinguishable from decision. The kit fit into her pocket. She walked toward Torres's bay like she'd been doing it all shift, confident, purposeful, the motion of someone belonging exactly where she was. Torres's monitors were singing their distress call. The heart rhythm had degraded into something that wasn't quite tachycardia anymore. It was the pattern of a heart losing its argument with physics. Compression. Fluid. Time. None of them were winning. Maya looked up as Sarah entered. The intelligence officer's eyes registered the supplies, calculated the implications, understood the violation happening. She didn't speak. She moved to her father's side and squeezed his hand. A signal. Reassurance. The language that predated words. Sarah approached the bedside, and her voice changed. The deferential tone evaporated. What remained was the voice she'd used giving orders to younger operators, the voice that expected obedience because the alternative was death. I need you to sit absolutely still. Not a request. Not negotiation. Command. Torres's eyes found hers. Recognition flickered. The same eyes that had watched Michael die, that had carried her son's body across a valley in Helmand province because leaders don't leave their people behind. His hand came up and pressed against his chest, not in pain, but in understanding. Help. Finally. Sarah's hands moved on their own. The skin prep. The needle advancement. The slight resistance as it penetrated the chest wall, then the sternum, then the pericardium itself. And then the hiss. The release. Dark blood flowing through the angiocath into a collection cup, fluid that had been strangling his heart, and with each milliliter withdrawn, the heart's rhythm smoothed. Simplified. Began to breathe again. The monitors responded. Heart rate dropping from 142 to 128 to 110. Blood pressure climbing. From 76/40 to 82/48 to 94/56. The electrical pattern on the screen transformed from the desperate climbing rhythm of a failing heart into the steady march of a soldier returning from the edge. 60 seconds. 90 at most. Torres had come back. But that wasn't the worst part for Hargrove. That wasn't the moment everything changed for the ER director with his kickback schemes and his board member favors and his carefully constructed mythology of authority. The worst part was the phone call that came at 4:06 a.m., while Sarah was still documenting the emergency intervention in the chart, while Torres was stabilizing in the cardiac ICU, while Dawn was still 2 hours away from breaking over Raleigh. A number appeared on the hospital's main line. Pentagon switchboard. And everything Hargrove had built in 8 months of careful deception was about to collapse in the span of 5 hours. 2 a.m. came like a blade. Torres's monitor screamed first, a high-pitched shriek that pulled every nurse in the ICU toward his room. Sarah was 3 corridors away, restocking supplies in the medication station, when she heard it. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in Sangin when a medevac helicopter took shrapnel. She moved. The hallway was chaos. Nurses converged on Torres's room. His daughter stood in the doorway, phone in her hand, eyes wide as saucers. Sarah pushed past them without speaking, and what she saw on the monitors made her breath stop, blood pressure 58/32 and falling. Heart rate 142. Oxygen saturation dropping from 88 to 84 to 79. The cardiac rhythm was there on the screen, but his perfusion was dying. His blood wasn't moving. Hargrove appeared behind her, his voice cutting through the alarm. "Step back, Chen. I'll handle this." He wouldn't handle it. Sarah could see it in the way his hands hesitated, the way his jaw tightened as he stared at the numbers. He'd never seen tamponade before, not in person. Not when every second cost a human life. She could feel his incompetence radiating like heat. Torres's breathing had become desperate and shallow, each inhale a struggle against the fluid crushing his heart. His chest heaved. His neck veins distended like he was being strangled from the inside. Sarah had seen this once before, in a sandstorm outside Sangin, and she'd held a man's hand while his breathing stopped. She wouldn't let that happen again. "We need an echo," Hargrove said, his voice climbing an octave. "Get cardiology on the phone." An echocardiogram would take 20 minutes. Torres had for minutes, maybe 5 before his heart stopped pumping altogether. The fluid around his heart, 200 milliliters, maybe more, was compressing it like a fist squeezing a sponge. His blood pressure was already a whisper. Sarah moved to the supply cabinet. Her hands were steady. This was muscle memory now, the kind that lived in your bones and didn't ask for permission. She pulled out a spinal needle, 18 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial space. An angiocath would have been better. In Sangin, they'd used an angiocath. But this would work. "Chen, what are you doing?" Hargrove's voice cracked. "Step away from the patient right now." "That's an order." She didn't answer. Didn't even look at him. She positioned herself at Torres's bedside, identified the landmarks on his ribs, the 5th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process. The needle went through skin, through subcutaneous fat, through the intercostal fascia. She felt the resistance change as it entered the pericardial sac. Then, the whisper of fluid moving through the needle. The first drops of pericardial fluid came back into the syringe, straw-colored, life-saving. She drew slowly, steadily, watching the pressure come off. 50 cubic centimeters, 100 cubic centimeters. His blood pressure climbed on the monitor, 60/34. 65/36. 150 cubic centimeters gone now. His heart rhythm tightened. His oxygen saturation stopped falling and plateaued at 81%. Hargrove had burst through the door now, his face the color of old hospital walls. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "My job," Sarah said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The needle was out. The fluid was gone, 200 cubic centimeters of it pooled in a specimen cup. Torres's vitals stabilized like someone had turned down the volume on a siren. His blood pressure climbed to 78/42. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 108. His breathing slowed from desperate and ragged to something that looked almost normal. Oxygen saturation rose to 89%, then 91%. Hargrove stood in the doorway, literally frozen, watching a nurse save a life he'd written off. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No words came. Torres's daughter rushed in and grabbed Sarah's arm. "What did you just—" She looked at the monitor, at her father's breathing, at Sarah's face. Understanding flickered across her features like a candle lighting. "You knew exactly what you were doing." Sarah cleaned up the supplies. Documented the time, 0207 hours. Documented the vital sign change. Documented everything that would be used against her in exactly 5 hours. She knew it was coming. She could feel it the way a sailor feels a storm rolling in across black water. Hargrove left without speaking. But his silence was louder than any threat. The next 3 hours passed like underwater footage. Sarah sat at Torres's bedside, monitoring his numbers, checking his breathing, listening to his heart. His daughter never left. Around 4 a.m., she put her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know who you are, but thank you." Sarah didn't respond. She was watching the horizon outside the ICU windows, where the night sky was beginning to pale at the edges. Dawn was coming. With it, everything would change. At 6:16 a.m., Hargrove appeared with security. Not hospital security. Real security, 2 men in navy jackets with the insignia of a private firm. His network. His insurance policy. One of them was holding a cardboard box. "Your employment with Sacred Heart Hospital is terminated, effective immediately," Hargrove said. He'd practiced this. She could hear it in the rehearsed precision of his words. "You performed an invasive medical procedure outside the scope of nursing practice. That constitutes a felony under North Carolina medical law. You're suspended pending an investigation by the state board." Sarah stood. She didn't argue. Arguing would prolong it, give him the satisfaction of a fight. Instead, she pulled off her hospital badge, the one with her photo and her name and the 3 years she'd spent walking these corridors, and placed it on the desk. "You'll be escorted from the premises," one of the security men said. "You're not to return to this facility without written authorization from administration." She was still wearing her scrubs. Light blue ones that were already wrinkled from the night shift. She grabbed the cardboard box and they walked her out. Past the ICU where Torres's monitors still beeped. Past the nurses' station where the staff suddenly became very focused on their charts. Past the break room where she'd sat every single night shift for 3 years, eating bad coffee and worse hospital sandwiches. The rain started just as they pushed through the ER doors. By 7 a.m., she was standing at the bus stop on Fayetteville Street, rain hammering down like it had a personal vendetta against her. The cardboard box sat in her lap, growing darker as water soaked through the cardboard. Inside it, a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a gift from Torres's daughter 2 years ago. A dying succulent that she'd been trying to keep alive for 6 months. A photo of Michael in his army dress uniform, taken 3 weeks before Sangin, smiling like he had forever ahead of him. Her hands didn't shake. That surprised her. She'd expected trembling, some physical manifestation of the end of things. But her hands were still steady. The kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst. The kind of calm that lives in people who've held a child's lifeless body in their arms and kept breathing anyway. She opened her phone. No messages. No calls. She scrolled to Torres's daughter's contact. She'd gotten it weeks ago, after Torres was first admitted. Her thumb hovered over the message box for exactly 3 seconds. Then she typed, "Check his jacket lining. The patch. Keep him safe." She sent it. Deleted the message thread. Put the phone away. The bus pulled up at 7:14 a.m., hydraulic brakes hissing like a dying animal. Sarah stood, gathered the cardboard box, and climbed the steps. She took a seat in the back, by the window, and watched Raleigh pass by in rain-streaked panels of glass. Sacred Heart disappeared behind her. Hargrove's office, his files, his network of corrupted board members and paid-off consultants, all of it became smaller and smaller until it was just a building like any other building. She didn't know that Hargrove was, at that exact moment, activating his contingency plan. 3 phone calls to hospital administrators across North Carolina, friends and allies who owed him favors. A call to the nursing board's executive director, slipping information about serious concerns regarding Chen's clinical judgment. A call to the dean of nursing at UNC Chapel Hill, where Sarah had earned her credentials, seeding doubts that would poison any reference check for the next 3 years. She didn't know that within 6 hours, a Taliban commander being escorted into Sacred Heart under federal custody would take one look at her face in a hospital corridor and begin screaming in Pashto that would unravel everything Hargrove had built. She didn't know that Torres had his hand on the unit patch sewn inside his jacket, SEAL Team 3, the unit that had embedded Sarah in Sangin to do things that required her records to be erased by the Pentagon. She didn't know that one phone call to a Navy SEAL captain would set in motion a series of events that would end Hargrove's career in the span of 5 hours. All she knew, sitting on the bus with a cardboard box and a dead child's photograph, was the rain and the road ahead and the absolute certainty that she'd done the right thing. Torres would live because she'd saved him. That mattered more than a job, more than a reputation, more than the slow systematic destruction of her professional future. The bus drove north, away from Sacred Heart, and Sarah Chen, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Combat Medic, Shadow Operative, and the woman who'd carried her son's body out of a firefight, watched the city disappear behind rain and time. She didn't know the Pentagon was already making calls. The doors to the trauma bay burst open at noon, and federal marshals wheeled in a man in restraints, a former Taliban commander extradited for war crimes, his face scarred and ancient with violence. The man's eyes swept the room in the methodical way of someone counting exits, and then they landed on Sarah. His voice cracked across the ER like a rifle shot, Pashto pouring out of him in sharp staccato bursts. The Shadow. The American woman who broke our network. The one from Sangin. Other marshals tensed, hands moving toward restraints, but the man kept shouting, his voice climbing higher. You destroyed the entire operation. We could never figure out how you knew. How you always knew. The fluorescent light seemed to dim. No one moved. The prisoner was still screaming in Pashto when Torres's daughter, Captain Melissa Torres, military intelligence, the one who'd been sitting vigil in her father's room, walked through the double doors. Her face went white. Pale. The kind of pale that comes when you suddenly understand something that rewrites everything you thought you knew. She stared at Sarah. Just stared. Her mouth opened. Her hands trembled at her sides, and when she finally spoke, her voice barely carried across the unit. You're Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. The kind that only comes when someone has read classified files, when someone in military intelligence has seen redacted service records and connected the pieces. When someone understands that the woman in scrubs had been something else entirely. Sarah didn't move. Her jaw tightened, just a fraction, but she held Melissa's eyes with the same steady calm she'd used to save her father's life. The room around them seemed to compress, all those monitors and beeping machines and bustling ER staff suddenly feeling very far away. Melissa walked to Torres's room, and Sarah followed. The captain's hands moved to her father's jacket, the one he'd worn the day of the accident, the one he'd refused to let anyone touch since arriving at Sacred Heart. She unbuttoned it with careful precision, fingers steady now with military discipline, and there, sewn into the lining with expert stitches, was a faded unit patch. Not Army Ranger insignia. SEAL Team 3. The unit patch of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. The mark of operators who didn't officially exist. Sarah's hand moved without her permission, touching the patch like it was made of glass. Her breathing didn't change. Her expression didn't crack. But her hands that had been steady through every humiliation, every fabricated complaint, every moment of Hargrove's systematic destruction, for 1 second those hands trembled. Not from fear. From recognition. From the weight of proof that she had carried her son's body out of Sangin herself, that Torres had been there, that the patch meant she'd done what mattered in a way the world would never know. He kept that his entire life, Melissa whispered. After you brought him back. The next sound was boots on tile. Precise, measured footsteps that made the ER staff straighten instinctively. A Navy SEAL captain in dress uniform walked through the trauma bay doors at 1:44 p.m., trailed by two enlisted men in identical dress blues. His presence had the quality of a blade, sharp, contained, dangerous in its absolute control. He didn't look left or right. He went directly to the hospital conference room where the board was assembled, and asked, not requested, to address them. Hargrove was there. Sarah watched from the hallway as she brought a water pitcher, as she moved with the invisibility that years of night shifts had taught her, as she became part of the background. The captain's voice came through the open door, measured and authoritative, each word falling like a gavel. This woman in your hospital. Sarah Chen. She holds 2 silver stars. The captain paused. Hargrove's head snapped up. She holds a Navy Cross for actions in Sangin that saved 17 American lives. 17. She performed combat medicine under my direct command in one of the most hostile operational zones this country has deployed to. She is classified at a level I cannot discuss in this room, but I can tell you this: every single person on this board owes her a debt you will never be able to repay. The captain's eyes found Hargrove across the table. And you fired her? For saving a patient's life. Hargrove's face drained. Not gradually. Completely. Like someone had turned a valve and let all the blood run out. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. My captain is correct. Another voice. Then another. The 7 doctors who had refused to treat Torres, who had cited non-compliance, liability concerns, protocol violations, began calling the hospital administrator within minutes of the captain's statement. Dr. Patel, Hargrove told me the patient was combative. He wasn't. Dr. Martinez, he said the family was threatening litigation. That was false. Each confession came harder than the last, but they came. All 7. A cascade of admissions that Hargrove had systematically lied to each of them, that he had prioritized his billing scheme over a patient's life, that he had manipulated them into abandonment. The state licensing board received a call from Navy Captain James Mercer. It was a very different conversation than the one Hargrove had initiated. Within 72 hours, Sacred Hearts Board suspended Hargrove pending investigation. The board members he'd called in favors with suddenly had no memory of their conversations. One resigned at 6 a.m. on Tuesday morning without explanation. Military intelligence began tracing the kickback scheme: 3 years of unnecessary CT scans, fraudulent billing, $2.4 million in false claims. The medical equipment supplier Hargrove had partnered with disappeared overnight, leaving behind documentation that proved the entire operation. The hospital's risk management department produced emails showing Hargrove had pressured them to flag Torres's case as high liability. The purchasing director found invoices showing inflated prices, kickback receipts, Hargrove's signature authorizing payments for procedures the hospital never performed. The FBI opened an investigation into federal billing fraud. The walls collapsed inward. At 8:15 a.m. on the 4th day, a security guard appeared at Hargrove's office carrying a cardboard box identical to the one Sarah had carried out into the rain. The guard's name was Marcus. He'd walked Sarah to the doors that morning, his face showing the only genuine sympathy she'd received all shift. Now he set the box on Hargrove's desk with the care one uses when placing something fragile. "I believe you know the way out, sir," Marcus said quietly. His voice carried satisfaction, the kind that comes from watching justice move, however slowly. Hargrove didn't argue. He didn't rage. He simply placed his diploma in the box, his professional licenses, a plant that had never received water. He walked past the nursing stations where he'd once commanded respect. Past the break room that fell silent when he entered. Past the trauma bay where his ambition had finally met something immovable. The same exit door that had closed behind Sarah Chen on a rain-soaked morning now closed behind him, and everyone who watched him leave understood that some falls are final. 6 months later, Sarah returned to Sacred Heart as Director of Emergency Medicine. The title didn't matter. What mattered was the unit patch framed on her office wall, the faded SEAL Team 3 patch from Torres's jacket, hung beside a new photograph. In the photo, Sarah's hands moved in deliberate shapes, teaching Torres's grandson the ASL signs for thank you. The boy's small fingers mimicked the motion, perfect concentration on his face, while his grandfather watched with the expression of someone who'd learned to appreciate miracles. Torres came every Tuesday morning for coffee in the break room. He'd recovered completely. The pericardiocentesis had been executed with such precision, with such absolute knowledge of what needed to happen, that the cardiac surgeons had reviewed the procedure 3 times just to understand how a night shift nurse had performed it so perfectly. No one discussed the classified aspects. No one asked questions that had answers locked behind federal security clearance. The cracked mug, world's okayest nurse, sat on Sarah's desk now, holding pens and trauma shears. The dying succulent had been replaced with a garden that thrived in the office window, green and alive and growing. Torres's daughter came by one afternoon with her son, and Sarah taught the boy new signs while his grandfather sat in the corner, watching with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you live because someone had the training, the courage, and the willingness to break every rule that mattered less than your life. That evening, walking to her car, Sarah passed a folding table outside a grocery store. A man sat there in a cheap suit, selling supplemental insurance to people who barely looked at him. Hargrove. His eyes flicked toward her face and then away, unable to hold her gaze, unable to meet the woman he'd tried to destroy and had succeeded only in revealing. Sarah kept walking. She didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge him. She simply moved past with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every humiliation, every fabricated complaint, every moment when she could have broken but chose instead to endure. The rain had stopped by then. The city around her was full of people moving through their lives, most of them unaware of what she was, what she'd done, or why a decorated military officer came to a hospital every Tuesday to thank a woman in scrubs. That's what makes heroism real. That's what makes sacrifice mean something. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you found Sarah's story incredible, you need to subscribe to this channel, because stories like this exist in hospitals everywhere, and they deserve to be seen. Like this video if you believe heroes deserve recognition, even when the world doesn't know their names. And comment below, what would you have done if you were Sarah? Would you have saved that patient's life knowing it would cost you everything? Let me know.